Unlike, I think, like radically individualistic evangelicals or Protestants, LDS people make the best Orthodox Christians. Really, the best, because they're humble. Like they love to, like, where can I tithe? Like I naturally tithe. Where can I give to the church? Where can I sacrifice? How can I help? Where can I give? They're naturally obedient to something greater than themselves. It's a natural humility and service. That's different than Protestants.
I've got a lot to say about this. Hello, Saints. My name is Jeff. I'm a pastor in Utah, exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there's something really cool to recognize about being here in Utah, and that is that there are other people here, not of a Latter-day Saint tradition, who are interacting with and living among Latter-day Saints and also ministering among Latter-day Saints. And I recently ran across a video of a priest from Utah who is of the Orthodox tradition. The Orthodox Church split away from the Roman Catholic Church just after the first millennium, so just after 1000 AD. And they have a very unique tradition and beliefs that in some ways look very Catholic, but in other ways they look very different. And in some ways look kind of Protestant in their rejection of certain Roman Catholic beliefs, but at the same time, still very different. So based on the fact that I'm not Orthodox or Latter-day Saint, but he's not Protestant or Latter-day Saint, I thought it might be fun for us to hear what he has to say about what it's like to minister in Utah among Latter-day Saints, what his thoughts are on the community and the beliefs, see where we're similar, see where they're different. It kind of makes sense why this is interesting to me. So let's dive in.
So given that a lot of their background has an emphasis on morality, there's a lot of good that you can draw from somebody who's coming from a LDS background. What are some of the blind spots that you think that they may have coming from that type of faith?
Well, theologically, it's just insanity. I mean, for us, I don't mean that in an insulting way. I just mean that when you look at the ancient faith and that Christ is truly God and the understanding of the Holy Trinity and the creation of the world. And, we say Christian, there's a lot of differences between Orthodoxy and Catholicism and being a Methodist, whatever it is, but at least you could gather those people and say Christ is fully God and fully man. And, God created everything out of nothing and these kind of basic Christian tenets. So Mormons are not Christians in this way.
Okay, so here we are coming in hot right off the bat. So this individual's name is Father Justin Havens, and he leads a congregation in Utah. And the interviewer is sort of setting him up, saying there's a lot of moral and ethical convictions that Latter-day Saints have that align with the rest of Christianity, but where are their differences? Now, I get that he might be passionate about the historic tradition of the Orthodox Church, which goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. But I do have to say I'm pretty disappointed at his word choice here. Using the term theological insanity, talking about Latter-day Saint beliefs, is making me feel a bit defensive, honestly, of Latter-day Saints. Even though I don't fully agree with Latter-day Saint on beliefs, I think it's easy to look at anybody in a different religious paradigm, and it might seem crazy to us. But I have to say, I feel a bit disappointed at his word choice there and wish he would have chosen a different word other than insanity when referencing Latter-day Saint belief. But let's see if we can still apprehend what is it he's getting at. The Orthodox Church sort of stakes a claim on saying we are the ones who have preserved the historic tradition of not only the early church, but the church fathers. So tradition is incredibly important to them. I would even say that their theological convictions are so richly tied to a spiritual heritage of tradition for a Latter-day Saint paradigm to move away from some of those theologically refined ideas, namely the Trinity and certain aspects about creation and the nature of God, right off the bat is just, it's so far outside of what Orthodox Christians hold to be so foundational and true that it is kind of boggling his mind. So he's coming in with a very clear demarcation of saying the rejection of these historic traditional beliefs that we have preserved going back a couple thousand years is really problematic in his mind.
And they're very offended if they hear that. And I explain to them, I know you call yourselves Christians and you love Christ, who you say to be, but Christ is not God to them. So they're not Christians in the proper sense in the world. And so it's totally unlike us in that way. There's no ultimate connection in that way.
Okay, so now he's going really practically here as to what that then means about how we define one another. And he's naming something that we talk about all the time on this channel, and that is Latter-day Saints saying that they are Christian because they follow Christ. He is emphasizing something that I recently emphasized, and that is a Jesus that is not fully God. truly in the fullest sense, the Alpha and Omega, the Ancient of Days, the one true transcendent God who was incarnate, lacking an embracing of that really is saying, well, you are other than us. You can't say that you are the same to us, being that that is something that is so core and foundational to how we define ourselves as Christians and the rest of mainstream Christianity. So I think it's a helpful perspective to hear someone when it comes to the regard for Christ and his deity as to how important that is in mainstream Christianity.
So that's a huge difference we have to be honest about. They say the church. Orthodox Christians, we say the church says this, the church says that. They say that because they have a heavy idea of the church, which, by the way, I should say is a beautiful thing. Because when they find orthodoxy, unlike, I think, like radically individualistic evangelicals or Protestants, LDS people make the best Orthodox Christians. Really, the best, because they're humble. Like they love to, where can I tithe? Like I naturally tithe. Where can I give to the church? Where can I sacrifice? How can I help? Where can I give? They're naturally obedient to something greater than themselves. It's a natural humility and service. That's different than Protestants, very different. And they're very obedient and they love and they respect the priesthood. And it's very beautiful, actually.
Okay, so I like the way he kind of follows this up with more specifically stating one of the reasons why this might offend Latter-day Saints when we're defining Christianity in certain ways, and there are some in the mainstream Christian view who would not consider them Christian. He's saying some of the hurt feelings come down to vocabulary, where if a Latter-day Saint is referring to Jesus by name or referring to salvation, they're using similar vocabulary, but the difference in definitions is directly tied to the difference in salvific understanding of who God is and how to enter into relationship with him. And as he goes into that a little bit further, he actually says, but there is actually a positive side to that, because when it's tied to the church or tithing or being obedient or serving, that aspect of how Latter-day Saints practice what they say they believe actually aligns with, in his case, he's saying, Orthodox Christianity.
They're very moralistic. Like we're moral too, we should be more. But for us, morality is just the outside. Like Dostoevsky says, you can't just do good for the sake of doing good. If God doesn't exist, then everything's permitted, right? So they're very moralistic, which can lead to a lot of pride, generally speaking. So like being holy, like I remember I asked 2 Mormon missionaries that came to my house, what's holiness? Taking in the trash cans for your neighbors and do it. I said, no, that's being virtuous and doing what's holiness. I described the life of St. John Maximovich or something, and they had just no context. Or I bring them into the church, and they sense the incense and like just the feeling in an Orthodox church. I said, do you feel that? I'm not like a frou-frou, like, do you sense that presence? And they go, we never experienced anything like this. So for them, holiness is not really, they're not even aware of that. That could be a blind spot. They're very moral. Check the box off, I think is a big temptation. Check the box off, be moral, make sure you do this. So it can be about externals in many ways.
This idea of holiness is something that I think is really important that he's touching on here. I know he's not going too deeply into it, but I too have found myself discussing concepts with Latter-day Saints tied to holiness, and I'm experiencing that similar words, different definitions idea when it comes to the concepts of holiness. I'm not saying Latter-day Saints don't have a regard for that which is holy or consecrated or sanctified, but when he's saying it's external, here's what I believe he's pointing to. In a traditional Christian theological paradigm, holiness is not this ethereal idea of goodness and that we should try to come up underneath that sort of abstract idea of that which is good. What he's getting at, even in quoting Dostoevsky, is he's saying that goodness isn't just some abstract idea that we all agree on. Goodness is tied to God, who is holy. He is the definition of that which is good and right and perfect. There's nothing not good about him. He is holy and high and lifted up. Maybe another way that we can define this is to say holiness and goodness is not this law that God perfectly fits up under, so we should try to perfectly fit up under it. There's a belief in mainstream Christianity that God is holiness. God is goodness. So when we are aligning ourselves with that which is good and right, it's not just external behavior that's trying to follow certain laws. It's actually relational alignment with the one who is the standard of goodness and holiness. It's very relational as opposed to performative or behavioral. So in those conversations he's having with these missionaries or that I've had with Latter-day Saints, there's definitely a different understanding or unique understandings as to what is holiness in relationship to who God is and how it impacts the way we live lives of obedience. And again, I'm not saying Latter-day Saints don't consider holiness important. They do. I mean, the things that go on in temples, I think, is a desire to be in alignment with holiness. But there's something theologically important about seeing holiness as something that is God by definition, as opposed to just a way of living or a way of practicing doing good things.
And I'd say one of the other big problems is that it's very emotional. There's a high sentimentality. And almost like some of my friends who are Pentecostals, it's very much like, I feel that. Like there's an innate trust of the heart, right? Like I have a burning in my bosom. This is a famous kind of phrase from Joseph Smith, etc. Like the way you discern if something's true is if you have a burning in your bosom. I'll give you an example. I gave a talk once to some LDS chaplains, I think it was, who were training at BYU. And I gave a talk about Orthodoxy, and it was nice. And nice conversation, but at the end, somebody said, oh, I could really feel the Spirit in what you were saying. And so from an Orthodox perspective, I'm just like I don't want to emotionally manipulate you. I want the truth to say itself, right? But there's very much a sense of I can feel it. And what they'll do with go door to door, I remember asking about Joseph Smith and Book of Mormon trying to convert you, and they circle around the pamphlet. They don't want to have a real conversation. I'll have a real conversation with them when they don't come around much anymore. But I said, how do you know this is true? In the search for truth. And we talk, and they'd say, I just know in my heart it's true. If you just meditate in your heart and you get that thing, do you feel that Joseph Smith is a prophet? And I was like, no. You're pulling me to this subjective place where I can't follow you. Let's talk about objective.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here, but let me give my take on it. This is something that you'll hear in the Protestant world as a critique of a common Latter-day Saint posture when it comes to measuring truth, and that is, do you feel that it's true? I am, on one hand, aligning with him on this in that feelings can be deceptive. I have felt things numerous times in my life where my feelings convinced me of something being true when it actually wasn't. So it's very difficult to go off of feelings alone when it comes to testing whether something is true. I would agree with him on that. I think a lot of Protestants, when you hear a Latter-day Saint saying, that I felt a burning in the bosom, or I prayed and received the revelation from the Holy Spirit that the Book of Mormon was true, that the church is true, that becomes really problematic because there are other aspects of belief that need to be factored in there. When it comes to history, when it comes to tradition, when it comes to the different teachings that have taken place throughout the generations of the church. And though it's true that I, as a Protestant, sit in a different sort of branch of Christendom than the Orthodox, because the Orthodox Church split away from the Roman Catholic Church about 600 years before the Protestants did. We still have a mutual respect and understanding that reason is important and evidences are important, and there are many aspects to even the corroboration of the testimony of individuals that can be traced all the way back to early church fathers and into the first century when it comes to concluding that this is true. All of that being said, he makes reference to the fact that Latter-day Saints are very similar to Pentecostals in some way. Well, guess what? I grew up in a Pentecostal church. So I actually agree with him in one way that I too have experienced this. I don't talk about it very much, but one of the ways that I really kind of feel like I resonate with Latter-day Saints is we can get into our feels. And I experienced that growing up, and honestly, emotion and feeling and experiencing the presence of God in deeply felt ways is important to not only who I am today, but was important to me growing up and even part of my own testimony in coming to Christ. And I know that to be the case also with individuals within the Latter-day Saint tradition, that they claim to have experienced similar things. So there is the other side of the coin that I would say feelings do matter, though. And getting the sense that something is true, I think, if we're going to be honest, is foundationally an important ingredient for anybody who's determining whether something is true or how they want to follow something. I think that it's pretty well observed, even from a scientific standpoint, when it comes to sociology and humanity, that a lot of times people make decisions more based on their feelings than on their mind. This is what makes used car salesmen really effective at their job if they're trying to sell you something that's not a very good car. No offense to any car salesman out there, but it's this whole concept that if someone can make a convincing enough argument to get into your feels, that's probably at the end of the day going to carry your decision a lot further than something that a lot of us can struggle with, and that is just a cold, analytical observation of the empirical data to make our decisions. So I do think that both can and do and should work hand in hand. And that's where I might diverge a little bit from what he's saying when a Latter-day Saint saying they feel certain things pertaining to their testimony should in some way disqualify them. But I do agree with him in saying that can't be the primary barometer, and I don't want to even assume that that is the primary barometer for all Latter-day Saints, but it is something that is communicated quite a bit to those of us on the outside as to how people obtain a testimony of the Book of Mormon, or that the church is true, or that Joseph Smith was a prophet.
For them, it's more authoritative other books like the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. This is more authoritative for them than the Scriptures. That's problematic, right, for obvious reasons. And so they don't know the Gospels very well. I mean, there's exceptions. Generally speaking, they don't know the Gospel. Say, what does Jesus say is in the heart of a man? When you tell them, I don't know, they say lies, deceits. Remember how when Jesus says, and he knew it was in their hearts. So our hearts are junk in the fall before they're pure. Blessed the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And until your heart's purified, you should trust the people that have done it, the saints. This is all new to them. They were just like, what? The idea that you wouldn't just go with the feeling and your warm fuzzy in your tummy and you wouldn't, that's shocking to them. I mean, our faith has to be rooted on something deep, both intellectually, historically, but also ascetical life. So that's shocking to them, but also comforting to them as they come into orthodoxy.
And just to take that a little bit further, and I'll just speak from my own experience, even when it comes to my exploration of the LDS tradition, and I've read through the Book of Mormon, and I've prayed that the Lord would reveal truth to me, where I need to see truth in some of these other things, where I have had a strong sense or a strong feeling that there are certain aspects of the Latter-day Saint tradition that are not true. What does that mean? And I've had numerous Latter-day Saints say, well, you're not praying with correct intent. You're not reading the Book of Mormon with proper intent. And they start to assume certain aspects of my intent. They start to look at my heart. And there are others who might say, well, it's just not your time yet. Eventually you will receive it. And the reason why I have a problem with that is because the only way that then I can have confidence that my feelings are accurate is when it agrees with the Latter-day Saint tradition. And to me, that is lacking so much more when it comes to making informed decisions, specifically in a faith space, that there are more factors that have to be brought into consideration beyond feelings. And the way he's saying that they handle this in an Orthodox paradigm is they look at the history, they look at the tradition, they look at the liturgy and these different aspects of historic connectivity that will help bring someone to an informed decision to enter into a saving relationship with Christ through his church in a way that isn't just based on feelings. What are the things that we use in the Protestant context? Our rallying point beyond feelings is always going to be the Scriptures. The Bible is not the only source of truth, but it is the one thing that we do bring everything up under to measure truth. So whether it's the truth of what we observe in nature, or the truth that we observe in other religious paradigms, or maybe even the truth in what we experience or what we feel, it has to come up under the authority of the Scriptures and be in alignment. And where it's out of alignment, we submit ourselves to God's authority through his revealed word in the Scriptures, so that our hearts and our spirits and our experiences can be in alignment with who God is. And that's for us why this whole concept of sola scriptura, or the authority, the trustworthiness, the inerrancy of the Bible, is very important to most of us Protestants, specifically evangelicals. So beyond feelings, Scripture for Protestants, history and tradition for Orthodox. And I would even say, I'm sure Orthodox also firmly plant themselves in the Scriptures, as well as Protestants to a much lesser degree, I would say. We do factor in history and tradition, though it's a little bit fuzzier and more fragmented in a Protestant world compared to the Orthodox Church.
I think also just, temple worship for LDS people is a little more mysterious, and it's an interesting thing. But day-to-day worship for LDS people at the Ward building is it has a Protestant feel, if you know the difference, and there's not a sense of mystery. It's casual. They're sitting in pews. They're dressed nice. That's one thing. LDS people know how to dress to church. When they come, they dress nicely. They wear their Sunday best, which I do think is important, actually. They're not coming like in sweats and a t-shirt or shorts, and they would never do that, by the way, which they have a sense of honor and reverence. But the incense and the reverence and is almost uncomfortable to them, and to many Americans, I think, because we're overly casual. But they're unique because they are religious people, but even the worship it's very casual. So the seriousness and the awe and the carefulness with which we serve the liturgy and we stand and cross ourselves and do this, I think that's shocking to them at first and a little scary.
Okay, so I'm going to handle this as best I can because on one hand, I understand where he's coming from. On the other hand, I would push back on behalf of Latter-day Saints. First of all, I'm sorry, but I sometimes like to preach in sweatpants and a hoodie, okay? Actually, I've never done that. I've preached in a hoodie, but not sweatpants. But I don't really wear sweatpants. I digress. How we dress is important to him because of the whole idea of honor and reverence. Totally get that. And I think that there's some merit to that. I will completely concede to the fact and admit and actually agree with the critique that things have gotten too casual in some Protestant worship services. One of the reasons why I think things have become more casual is because we feel that we should just come as we are. We shouldn't have to dress up or look a certain way, but God is willing to take us exactly as we are. And one of the things that we talk about in the Protestant church is making sure that we're no different on Sunday than we are the rest of the week. It's huge for evangelicals. It's foundational to us that a relationship with God goes so far beyond our religious practices or our Sunday mornings. So there's something even psychologically about dressing nice for church, but then going about the rest of your week dressed like this. And you don't have to agree with that, but that's some of the reasoning behind that. And I will say, though, when it comes to having reverence for a worship space, there's some merit to that. And I think that's where we do fall short in the Protestant space. My wife, Joy, has frequently stated that she wishes that we had spaces that were sort of designated to be a little bit more revered and a little bit more set apart for worship and entering into the presence of God like you see in other Christian buildings. And where he is saying that that's really important from an Orthodox standpoint, that makes complete sense because that worship service, that worship experience, that time of gathering as the church is very sensory when it comes to sights and sounds and smells, and all of that is really important in the experience, the worship experience in an Orthodox tradition. And it is tied to sort of this mystical experience of spiritual alignment with God and entering into that spiritual space. The amount of reverence and esteem and consecration that Latter-day Saints regard the temple with, and that is about as reverent a regard that someone can have for a space.
One thing with LDS people is, even though their history, they were very other, right? Then Utah couldn't become a state because of everything, and so I think that unfortunately there was a thing that said they're supposed to be a peculiar people. That's one of their prophets said, a peculiar people. Hardly. They are the most, they want to be the most American. The biggest holidays in Utah are Halloween and 4th of July. Easter's just another day. It's a family day and things. It's just, for us, Easter's everything, Pascha's everything, right? So it's just so different. It's very kingdom of this world. There's definitely a prosperity gospel aspect to Mormonism. If you're a good person and do the right things are going to go well from you now and then in the next life. And it's culturally, to be successful, which I think is not what the gospel says, actually. And I think that they want to be validated as a people, maybe after years of being kind of, not. So, they're the most American as apple pie, and they're not, they're normal. Up until years ago, they didn't call themselves Christians. That wasn't until they were really losing people in the 80s and 90s, and there was those commercials when I was a kid in New York. Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints kind of marketed themselves more as Christians. So this desire to fit in. Mormons are the best looking people, trendy, everything. Like it's like the women are beautiful, the men are handsome. So I think there's something about being successful in a worldly way that is really important to them. And I think that Orthodoxy, of course, the ancient church, gain the whole world and lose your soul. Or St. Catherine, who was a knockout beautiful, but Jesus said, "You're ugly to me," because of her soul. That's shocking to them at first. And the idea that they have to shed that, I think, is difficult. And I think that that's a unlearning that has to happen. It's not about checking boxes off or just being a good person. Jesus didn't come to make us good boys and good girls. He came to transform us from the very middle, from the very center of ourselves. And that's shocking to them. It's inspiring to them. They want it, but it's a whole other mentality to them, if that makes sense.
Okay. Again, there's such a mix here of things that, at least in my experience, I completely see where he's coming from. I understand. And others where I'm like, I'm not seeing it the exact same way. The whole idea around Latter-day Saints saying that they're a peculiar people definitely is something that I've culturally encountered. And I'm sure that some of that goes back to just historically, how they were marginalized, they were chased out of various areas. Even in Utah, they were very otherly for a while until they became a state. So I think that's kind of baked into sort of their psyche. But on the other hand, I totally agree that Latter-day Saints are some of the most American. They're very much into the American way, American ideals, patriotism, the pioneer heritage, the whole idea of success and doing your best to try hard, to work hard, to accomplish certain things. That's a Latter-day Saint tradition, going back to the beehive state itself in Utah, where all of these high-performing individuals were able to do so much to create community and to push towards success, which is something that is very Latter-day Saint. In fact, even when you look in the different spaces like acting or business or entrepreneurship or fashion, like some of the most successful people in a lot of these areas are Latter-day Saints who come from that striving toward excellence in their work ethic that is very much part of a Latter-day Saint paradigm. And I think the way a lot of Protestants sort of understand that is to say, well, it's because it's a very performance-based religion in that you have to perform and always do good and always try a little harder to be a little better in order to remain temple worthy, to remain worthy of a celestial experience that kind of constantly compels Latter-day Saints to always strive toward excellence. Now, as to whether that's a fair assessment or a fair connection or not, I don't know if I'm one to say necessarily, but I think he's getting at a similar thing when he's saying that there's this sort of, let's check the boxes, make sure we're doing everything right. And that leads to, at the very least, this image of high performance and high success. And it sounds like what he's getting at here is, from an Orthodox perspective, this whole, come as you are to God and let him meet you in your depravity and the conditional fallenness and sinfulness and brokenness of who you are, and let him be the one to bring about the restoration of your soul and the redemption of who you are, as opposed to it being sort of a performative box-checking experience. So that's, I think, what he's getting at here, that he says when that's communicated to a Latter-day Saint, that it's refreshing to them. It almost sounds like it's a Orthodox way of describing grace, God's grace, meeting us where we are, transforming us where we are, as opposed to it being something that might look a little bit more performance-based.
I think that Mormons have a dynamic view of the next life. Again, even though it's very skewed and not Christian, they have this idea that we continue to grow, and that growth never ends. Like St. Gregory, the saints talk about this, how a parabolic line grows to another line to infinity. It doesn't touch it. So the saints, our holiness in God and theosis, God willing, and that continues forever in the next life. Creator and creation never come together, whereas they believe falsely that you become creator, you become a God. I mean, it's a whole other conversation, but they have at least a sense that heaven is dynamic. Whereas I think they might look at Protestantism, and even the way the Protestants kind of try to proselytize to them is terrible, like holding up their temple garments and in protest and putting them in, like, if you're an LDS person, you go, that's a Christian. No thanks. When they see the humility and the love of Orthodox and the beauty of Orthodox and the knowledge of Orthodox, and I think a lot of people think heaven's going to just be like rolling around with puppies, and I mean, I hope it's as good as that. And we're going to be, holding hands, and it's just like, oh, and like it's just this static. We're here now. Whereas when you read the Church Fathers speaking about the kingdom of heaven, and it's a constant dynamic growth that has no end. I mean, it's so spectacularly beautiful, right? And C.S. Lewis talks about that in the last battle, further up and further in, and one world became a whole nother world, and this continuous growth, that's very appealing to an LDS person who knows their faith, that Orthodoxy has an understanding of that. And it's not just like, oh, you're baptized, you're saved now. What do you do? Go save other people. There's a sense of a dynamic growth into the likeness of God. Because they like this idea of theosis. They steal St. Athanasius the Great. God became man so that man can become God. But we mean God's by adoption, right? Saying everything that God is by nature, we're called to become by grace, as the saint says. But they believe that you become by nature, which is, of course, complete heresy, and they're not even Christians in that way. But the fact that that's appealing to them, they see that Orthodoxy cares about that we are called to be like God and to grow into and so I think that's an appeal that's very strong, and that they feel like it's not just static and join the club, that there's in this life, but also in eternity, there's a continual growth in Christ. Yeah.
Okay, so that's some real talk there, and I've got a lot to say about this. First of all, I appreciate his acknowledgement of a dynamic view of the afterlife and a Latter-day Saint paradigm. He said that multiple times there. That very much aligns with the Orthodox view, because Orthodoxy is unique from the rest of Christianity in their understanding of God, where they believe there's a demarcation between the essence of God and the energies of God. This gets into a lot of intricate doctrines that I don't know well enough about, but know enough to explain it here, that God in his essence is eternally mysterious and almost unreachable, but in his energies and in our way to experience him and enter into relationship with him, we can not only be fully immersed in that, but we can actually take on those attributes. So the Orthodox view is one that after this life, there is an ongoing sort of taking on God-likeness in the energies and in the attributes of what he is like, though never reaching in essence who he is. And that's where in a Latter-day Saint paradigm, it sounds similar in this dynamic afterlife where theosis or deification, or this idea of becoming more like God, to the extent in the Latter-day Saint view, though, that you can actually become God, not him as an individual, become him like a son can become like their father. The problem with that from an Orthodox standpoint is Latter-day Saints believe that Heavenly Father and humanity, we're the same species. And that is very much in violation of what Orthodox Christians believe and what the rest of mainstream Christianity believes. So an acknowledgement of where there's similarities there, this dynamic view of the afterlife, I appreciate him acknowledging that and honoring that from a Latter-day Saint view, even though there are some important differences. Where I do need to push back, just, being the third wheel Protestant here talking, is the static view of the afterlife that he claims Protestants have comes down to in the Protestant world, terrible way of communicating what the afterlife is like. There's just not been very good teaching around it. There's solid belief. There's not only biblical belief, but that there is belief that actually does reach back into even some of the church fathers that he was referring to. We believe that heaven is going to be eternally dynamic. And I cringe whenever Protestants or evangelicals say, heaven is just going to be like an eternal worship service. I don't believe that. And I don't think most evangelicals do. I appreciate the sentiment behind it, that God is going to be at the center of it, and every aspect of our being for eternity is going to be an adoration and worship toward him, but not worship in the sense where we're just standing around singing songs or playing harps. That's just not what the scriptures teach, and it's not what most responsible pastors teach. That said, we probably don't teach on heaven and the afterlife enough. In fact, that is a strong conviction I have. I just preached a sermon series not too long ago on heaven, and I'm trying to bring some biblical reality into our understanding of the afterlife, because it is dynamic. Paul says that what we will be and what we will become in the afterlife is beyond our imagination, so we kind of have to leave it there. So on one hand, I appreciate the Protestant acknowledgement that the whole purpose of heaven is that it's not just a place, but it's a person. It's being in the presence of God for eternity, and we will indefinitely be worshiping him. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be in a state of sort of static, just worship, adoration, and petting puppies and playing golf. I don't believe it's going to be that. We just leave it in that realm of mystery. and make sure that the qualitative aspect to heaven is being in his presence for eternity. So I think that's really healthy for him to sort of acknowledge those distinctions. And one thing that he touched on that I appreciate, and he even being an outsider when it comes to Protestantism, the way that he says that a lot of Protestants try to communicate the gospel in a demeaning way, in a derogatory way, in an insulting way, making fun of Latter-day Saint beliefs and practices like holding up the garments, and in some way then trying to convince them that our idea of eternity is better than theirs. In my opinion, it misses the mark, and that's why I don't involve myself in that type of methodology or communicating or even posture. Now, if there are other people that feel that conviction, they have that right to do so, but I agree with him that Protestants, in large part, have not done the best job of communicating the sweetness of the gospel, the sweetness of the good news of Jesus and his love and our regard for our relationship with him when we're just trying to put down the people around us. So a lot of really interesting perspectives and takes here. I feel a little bit exhausted trying to not just bridge a Protestant paradigm and a Latter-day Saint paradigm, but also connect it with an Orthodox paradigm, which is foreign to me. So I might have missed a few things or misunderstood certain things, but I hope this was a helpful exercise to see how somebody who is an outsider from both the Latter-day Saint and Protestant perspective is viewing the Latter-day Saint paradigm and some of the perceptions and beliefs that are had from somebody who is passionately Orthodox. I hope to do some more videos like this where I hear how other people outside the LDS and Protestant paradigm view each other, and I think we can get some interesting perspectives there. So if you like this video, hit the thumbs up, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you'd like. There's going to be an extended cut of this video on Patreon that you can have access to, as well as other ways to interact with me and other people in the Hello Saints community. And if you don't support me on Patreon, it's totally fine. Keep coming back for more videos. We have more to talk about. So until next time, I'll see you later, Saints.